Thank you very much for coming and joining us. I'd like to welcome you all. This is the third event in the Building Bridges series. We've had two series. We had one last fall of dialogues, and this series is called Building Bridges, Building Healthy Collaborations for Climate Justice. And our first one was in February on climate justice kind of overview. And last month we had one on historical trauma, and Bayo joined us for that, as well as Pat McCabe, and we had Alesa Miles. We had a wonderful conversation. And this one is on unpacking privilege. And we're framing it kind of a little into, the time that we're in, the crisis of the COVID. Next month, we will be talking about being an ally. And then we'll be wrapping up this series and continuing on with some more other offerings after this. So please do give us your feedback for anything you'd like us to see covered, any speakers that you'd like to invite in. We'd love to get your feedback. So as you come in, if you could just turn off your video, that would be great. This is co-hosted by the Inner Resilience Network and the Social Justice Working Group, and the members of which are here in the room, many of them, pretty much most of them. So thank you for all your good work. And we're trying to, the reason why we're co-hosting the Inner Resilience with the Social Justice is because we're holding these conversations. It's not just about social justice, this is about healing, and it's about how we move the conversation forward in a way that is really getting at the deeper stuff. So we've had a lot of internal conversations and deep dives around this, and it's been, some of these subjects are very, very hard and intense. And I think the subject that we have today about privilege is especially triggering for people. I've already had a few interesting interactions with people around privilege, and people that want to see that it doesn't exist, or it exists only in certain ways, and so there's a lot of stuff around this subject. So we believe at the Inner Resilience Network that this is an inside job as well as an outside job, and that asking ourselves questions and really looking deeply at our own unconscious patterns is a really important part of social change. So that's the intention of these dialogues that we're holding. And we want to just really set that space, because we know that this is messy work, and it's not easy work, and we don't want it to be hard work, though. We want you to feel safe and to know that it's all welcome here, that we embrace the messiness, we embrace the differences of opinion, whatever they are, the blocks that we might have or not, or that we think we see in each other. So it's all welcome, with compassion and openness. Let's move this conversation in a good way to build the better world that we all want. So privilege is it's a hard subject to get at, because it's sort of like the water, if you're coming from a privileged place, it's the water that you swim in, and how do you see the water, right? I know that's been talked about that way. So really, this is not about calling anybody out. It's not about saying, check your privilege. At least I don't see it that way. It's about calling ourselves in. Let's call ourselves in and be with each other and getting curious about the subject, and finding fresh ways of opening up kind of hidden places inside ourselves around the subject, and as well as really grounding it in facts and figures and what's really happening in the world. So it's an inner and an outer. And that's reason why the two speakers that we have here, Ayako and Bayo, are really, I think, a wonderful complementariness, because Ayako's very grounded in a lot of statistics, and I'm not saying you aren't, Bayo, I don't actually know, but I know Ayako is, and she's going to be giving us some of that information. And Bayo, you know, I know you are very much about like really moving dialogue forward in a fresh way. And I think that's what we really need in this time, you know, because sometimes we get stuck in these loops and we go into the spin cycle around a subject, especially in social justice stuff. And so I really love what you bring to the table around dialogue, because it provokes our thinking and opens our minds in ways that maybe we hadn't thought of before. So I'm really happy that you're both here. And now that was the informal introduction. I'll give the more formal introduction, which is, so Bayo is a poet and a philosopher and a psychologist and a professor. And I love this, Bayo. He's passionate about the preposterous. He's the executive director and chief curator of the Emergence Network, which he calls a post-activist project. And he's host of the online writing course, We Will Dance with Mountains, Writing as a Tool for Emergence. His current projects also include being a co-host and facilitator of One World in Dialogue. He's a board member of Mutual Aid Network, USA, consultant for UNESCO, and is a board member of the Real Economy Lab, and a lecturer at the Department of Psychology of the Covenant University in the UK. So the Emergence Network is how I first heard of Bayo, and it's just a wonderful place to bring many different minds together, minds and hearts. And to quote what he says on his website, he hopes to inspire a diffractive network of sharing, a slowing down, an ethics of entanglement, an activism of inquiry, a politics of surprise, one that does not treat the crisis of our times as exterior to us, or the solutions that conventional activism offers as discrete or separate from the problems we seek to nullify. Ah, well, that's just a beautiful breath right there of open thinking. And now I'd love to introduce Ayako, who I have the pleasure and honor of working with on this series. And she is also part of the Social Justice Working Group. And she's just on fire right now with doing so much good for furthering the conversation around social justice, especially within the transition movement, which we are a working group of Transition US, which is an international movement. Many of you here, I'm sure, have heard of it because you've come through that link. Ayako serves on the board of Transition in Berkeley, and she's on the steering committee for the Green Leadership Trust, a coalition of green nonprofit board members of color, promoting equity and inclusion within the environmental network or movement. And Ayako is, as I mentioned, on the Social Justice Working Group, and she was also recently appointed to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's National Environmental Justice Advisory Council. So she's really on the front lines for us right now in this capacity. So we're really happy to welcome you, Ayako. Thanks. And I also wanted to give a shout out here to my IRN colleague, Galen Myers, who is behind the scenes of kind of holding and tracking things. So if you have any questions, you know, he'll be looking at the chat and letting people in, and then later he's going to help us lead the discussion. So hi, Galen.
Hello, everybody.
All right. Well, so let's get started with the conversation. And you know, unpacking privilege in a time of crisis is the topic. So let's first just get on the same page with the definition of privilege. What does that mean? so that we all are talking about the same thing. And I'll just use the kind of the Random House Dictionary version, which defines privilege as a right, immunity, or benefit enjoyed only by a person beyond the advantages of most. I've also heard it being described as that invisible package of unearned benefits. So that could be like a more concise way of talking about it. So this is what we're going to be referring to when we say privilege, and this is in many different contexts. I mean, there's many kinds of privilege. We're going to be speaking about, racial inequity, but also there's other kinds of inequity, many kinds. So and then we're going to be talking about how that fits into how it's playing out right now in a disaster scenario that we're in. So first, let's just ask about privilege itself. And I'm going to just do the first go-round question, and Aya and Bayo, whoever feels, I guess maybe we should have Ayako first, so she can give us a little more of the historical, because we're going to ask, why does privilege exist, is the first question. And it's a very kind of, I know that's a very broad brush, kind of open question. So I invite you to just take that wherever you want to go with that. And there's historical, there's economic, there's cultural connections to that, there's spiritual connections, racial connections. So, and I know you have been focusing a lot on the historical and maybe the economic. So maybe you'd like to go first and just give us a little bit of information about why privilege exists.
Sure, I can do that. So I did post the agenda in the chat box for your reference, and also a link to a shared doc, which has some of the language of around statistics, so that you can read it and as I kind of read it out loud. It's at the bottom of the shared doc. It's a Google Doc in the chat box. Okay. So I wanted to talk about economic injustice or economic privileges, as well as the historical legacy of how that came about. I'll just go with the numbers, the hard numbers first. As of 2017, and I'm mostly comparing Black African American and versus white American. The numbers between Asian American and white Americans are pretty comparable, actually. But when it comes to African Americans and Indigenous Americans, for example, children in poverty, white Americans have 11% of their kids living in poverty. And if you're Indigenous or African, it's a full 33%. So it's 3 times more likely that if you're a person of, or if you're Black or Indigenous, you're 3 times more likely to be poor as a child. And then another statistics in 2017, children whose parents lack secure employment. So these are kids whose parents are, probably don't have a large amount of savings, closely linked to poverty. For white Americans, it's a whopping 20%. Whose parent for where the children whose parents lack secure employment. But for Indigenous Americans, it's 47%. 47% of the Indigenous kids out there have parents who lack a secure job, and 42% of African American kids have parents that lack secure employment. Another statistic from 2017, children living in households with a high housing cost burden. So the housing costs are high compared to income. For white Americans, it's 22%. That's pretty high still. But if you're Indigenous, it's 30%. And if you're African American, it's 45%. So fully more than double Black Americans struggle with high housing costs. That outweighs their income level. And the last statistic under this, by the way, this data is from the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and I put the source of the link in the source document behind Annie E. Casey Foundation where it says that. And so teens not in school and not working. For white Americans, 5% of teens are out of school and not working. For African Americans, it's double 10%. And for American Indian, it's 13%. So that's economic. And then there are things like fatal police shootings. So African Americans make up less than 13% of the US population, but a full 31% of the fatal police shooting victims are African American. And if you're age 15 to 19, if you're African American, you're 21 times more likely to be shot and killed by police. 21 times more likely to be shot and killed by police than as compared to white boys of the same age, 15 to 19. By the way, some of these statistics, I got the help of Danielle on the call, so thank you, Danielle, for working on this for the last 2 days. So another statistic, Black youth are 10 times more likely to be arrested for drug crimes than white kids. The white youth are more likely to abuse drugs. And some of the reasoning behind the high amount of arrest is because they're stopped and frisked more. African Americans are stopped and frisked more. There's a statistic in here about that as well. The average net worth of a Black household in the United States is $6,314. That's the net worth, as compared to $110,000 for the average white household in the United States. That's about a couple digits off. And there's historical reasons why there's this economic disparity, which I'd like to go into next. But another statistic, while a college-educated white American has an average net worth of $75,000, a college-educated Black American has an average net worth of less than $17,500. Black people in the US do not have the decades and centuries of freedom to purchase, work, and amass real estate property, savings, or wealth. Until in the mid-20th century, they were denied rights and as a result were owned and were not owners of assets. So last one in every 15 Black men are incarcerated. 1 in every 106 white men are incarcerated. And there are reasons why these numbers are higher for African Americans. Another one, we know that this pandemic is not equally lethal and is disproportionately affecting poor and marginalized communities. It's been in the news. The death rate from COVID-19 for Black and Latino New Yorkers is roughly twice that of white New Yorkers, and Black Chicagoans are dying at nearly 6 times the rate of white residents. There are reasons for these things. Why are these disparities? So I took, I'm a lawyer, and I took a course about environmental injustice in the United States with Environmental Law Bar Association of California, and I took a course about environmental justice history. And under Dr. Bhavina Shamasudar of Occidental College, she outlined this timeline for me. It's a very shorthand. I'll go through it. It's in the notes, shared doc notes as well. So we got, colonization from the 1600s to the 1900s. The whites came from Europe and looked at the United States as a wilderness. Even though the land was owned, it wasn't recorded with deeds and paperwork the way Europeans were. So the European men came and took the land. And, that has an economic effect long-term. And the conservation movement came in the late 1800s in the United States. People with privilege prioritized conservation issues. And it was led famously by John Muir and the Sierra Club and Audubon societies. These green nonprofits were created back then. And World War II ended that era of the conservation movement, and it gave birth to the chemical weapons that also causes injustices, but that's another tangent. So the founder of the Sierra Club, for example, he was an environmentalist, but LeConte was also a eugenicist. So some of the, the environmental movement had racism baked into it from the beginning, actually. And then after World War II, US suburbs grew, but not all Americans were included in these economic growth. If you were African American, you were denied loans to buy houses in certain neighborhoods based on race because of a policy called redlining, which was enforced by real estate agents, in which very few loans were given to people of color or Black or Indigenous people in redline districts, or were charged higher interest rates. So there was an economic policy that discriminated against BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, so that they couldn't move into these neighborhoods, or were charged higher interest rates. Environmental justice has its roots in the civil rights movement. That's not about privilege, but it's a related issue. It's in the notes. Sorry, I'm just going through. And in 1984, this is California history that I'm talking about, and I apologize if it's a little West Coasty, but California Waste Management Board paid a consulting firm called Searle Associates to define communities that won't resist sightings of undesirable land use. So basically, businesses were plotting to put dirty industries very close to neighborhoods where they thought that people didn't have power. So undesirable land use was a study. This was a study done to specifically target communities that were disenfranchised so that we could dump our trash next to their houses. And there was a landmark study in 1987. This is a very famous national study by the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice called Toxic Waste and Race. For the first time, that study in 1987 documented the correlation between race and their proximity to pollution, that there was a relationship between whether you lived, what your race and color of skin was, and whether you lived near a polluted site. So there were systematic reasons that put dangerous chemicals, dangerous polluting factories, and all these infrastructures in neighborhoods of color. That it doesn't, and I'll just say, like, slavery in the writing of the US Constitution in 10 articles very intentionally confirmed the holding of Black people as slaves. This country was founded on the economic boom that resulted from the extraction of taking away the rights of Black people and their way, and the money they could have earned was, that's what supported the colonies, the cotton farms and all these agriculture were supported by the slaves. And yeah, go ahead. Is my time up? You're muted, Jul.
Whoops, thank you. Yeah, let's
okay.
And give this advice. I wanted to make sure you we also referred to the fact that this country was also built on stolen land too.
Thank you. But these are reasons why Black, and then there was Reconstruction, there was slavery, and then there was the Jim Crow era, the segregation era. All of these eras were defined by laws that discriminated against Black people economically and socially, but economically. There's lots of reasons why these economic disparities resist, and that's why people don't have good health care, and that's why they're getting sick and dying right now. So that's my belief. I'll stop there. Thank you for listening.
Well, I think it's more than in belief. I think it's facts.
I think they're factual. Yeah.
And Aya, you have done such due diligence with all of these resources and links. And I want to encourage everybody to check out the shared doc that we have, the shared Google Doc, because she's put a lot of those links, put some up there myself. But please, you know, check those out. So thank you for that. That really, whew, that was a lot of really powerful information.
Thank you.
So take a moment and switch it over to you, Bayo. However, wherever you want to go with that is your choice.
Yeah.
Why does privilege exist?
Well, my first impulse is to thank my sister Ayako for sharing that. Thank you, sister, and well, to greet everyone. It's my people are known for greeting. It's baked into my body. Speaking about privilege, I have the privilege of meeting everyone anew every moment, which is the cosmology of the Yoruba people. Well, I thought the question was curiously framed. I don't usually give myself over to questions of why. I'm much more attracted or feel invited to the mechanics, you know, the questions of how do bodies get formed in particular ways to the exclusion of other possibilities. I'm not American, I'm not African American, but I'm African, and I'm sure if you had statistics, Ayako, for people in Africa, it might be 10 times worse than those you just mentioned in the United States. But there's an issue with that. So right in the so-called global South, and especially in Africa, and we speak all the time about how colonization undid us. That is, we're poor because of colonization. I think it's not so much the fact that we are poor because of colonization. I don't think colonization made us poor as such. I think colonization enacted certain definitions that we now subscribe to. And that is the problem of definitions, which is in some way my own way of contributing to the discourse around privilege. That privilege is a historical and material problem of definitions. Who gets to define what poverty is? Who gets to say who's well off or who isn't? And these definitions are not just ideational effects. They're material, historical, gastronomical, microbial. It's even more than human. It's how an assemblage, a community of bodies and processes come together to make certain definitions possible or intelligible. I've told this story more than once. If I've said it here, then yeah, it's good to repeatability is one aspect of wisdom. So I'm just going to share it again. If you've heard it before, I used to teach at Schumacher College in UK, in a small town called Devon. And I remember teaching once there and sharing my story of how I, as a Black person, who is now discovering that I'm a Black person. Because if you grow up in Africa or in Nigeria like me, where everyone else is Black, the definition Black doesn't really count as much. It's not useful, see? But when you step out of that space, then you are invited to consider that you're black and there's a box for that, so tick it. So I've been ticking many boxes ever since I started to speak outside my country. So I remember sharing this story with my students, and how I'm usually pulled aside for secondary screening. It almost always happens to me. So I started to doubt their randomness, but I was always pulled aside for secondary screening. Sir, could you step aside, please? Sir, could you step aside, please? Sir, could you step aside, please? It was just a parliament of voices inviting me to step aside, like I was some dictator ruling a small country. And I always did step aside, of course. And I noticed that, I quickly learned that when you travel, always be on your best behavior. Smile, be polite, don't frown, definitely don't ask for the manager, do as you're told, walk the line, that kind of thing. And I shared the story with my class, and I remember one of the students, a German guy, came to me afterwards and said, "I'm so sorry. I'm really, really sorry that you have to go through this. That I am a white heterosexual male, and I just walked through an airport, and I don't ever feel that I need to put on my best behavior, or I need to be good, or I need to put on my cap the front way, or I need to put down my hoodie or something like that. I just breeze through. But you get to experience all these things, and I don't. So I'm sure I take all the air in the room when I walk into the room. I'm sure I suck it in, so that there's little left for people like you." And I, with great compassion, really some great compassion in my heart, I rejected his apology. I said, "I'm sorry, I cannot accept your apology." And he was shocked and said, I'm sorry. Did I say anything wrong? Did I do anything wrong? Did I not put it right? And, I said there that if I accepted your apology, and don't take this the wrong way, brother, if I accepted your apology, then I'll be participating in the idea or in the notion that there is only one place of power, that privilege is so tight and so anorexic and so sealed and so fixed to reality that there aren't other possibilities for being and becoming. And participating in that reality is part of what privilege is. It's not usually talked about this way. I speak a lot from a Yoruba indigenous, neo-materialist, feminist, eco-feminist perspective, when I say that privilege invites material participation, that it cannot exist without excluding the other. That means part of the definition of privilege is the victims, the victimhood, that it proliferates, that it defines out of the picture. But privilege is not just a set of relationships, it's this exclusionary dynamic that excludes other realities from happening. The tricky part is those excluded realities now see that tiny space as the only place of power, privilege as the definitive reality, the only place of being alive or vital or animated in the world is this tiny place of privilege. And that is the most devastating effect of colonization, to lose sight of the fluidity of becoming and the other realities for being alive that are possible. And so I said the reason why I reject your apology is because to accept your apology would be an act, ironically, of white privilege. Because I would be participating in white privilege. Even if I don't, and I don't think privilege is something you have, I think it's something that enlists bodies, enlists people, enlists furniture, enlists technologies in this heterogeneous complicated network, right? so that even victims that do not possess certain benefits also participate ironically in reinforcing privilege. So I said I reject the apology because I see other places of power possible. What if, even though I cannot walk through an airport in 5 minutes like you can, what if I have access to ancestors, and I know how to listen to the voices of my people? What if there is some beauty and exquisite power in being able to gather around the fire and sing together, which is possibly entirely missing, in modern settlements? What if there were ways of communing with mountains and ecology and land and stones and healing, ways of conceiving of healing and healing paradigms that your psychoanalytic traditions and frameworks do not know how to hold space for? What if all of these are missing too? So I was also speaking about these are other spaces of power, elsewheres, otherwises that modernity does not have a voice to articulate or to render intelligible. So I'll stop there for now, but the reason I tell that story is to offer a decolonial perspective on the subject of privilege. That privilege is a very tiny space. It's a fragile compilation of power and powerful networks. However, it is also deeply problematic in sense that it's not just problematic in terms of what it excludes. And I think people should stop apologizing for their privilege. I think it's more problematic in terms of how it tends, how it will over time eat itself up. Like what's happening right now as I read in the United States, that it's predominantly white people in some states in America that are on the streets right now protesting their lockdown and insisting on their freedom to walk, and be free and to be human, And I noticed that the very notion of being human, that category, that notion, the figure of the human is already a space of privilege, because many people like me were denied access to the vaunted category of human, where we were either not quite human or inhuman. And the whole technology, the transatlantic technology of slavery, was to either render us human over time or to just banish us to the sweltering heat of the edges of where the human was performing its world-building activity. And I'm saying that maybe the human is beginning to become exhausting right now. This stretch of land, this terrain, this continental stretch that is called the human is becoming exhausting. It has too much weight for ecologists to hold space for, and it's dying. And the COVID-19 phenomenon is just one example of how this fabric is tearing itself apart, and how we're being invited to other spaces of power collectively. Let me leave it at that.
Deep.
Wow. That's leaving it in a really very, thank you, Bayo. It just, I don't even quite, there's so many little threads in there and gems of things that you've said that are going to take a while for me to process, but yeah, thank you for all of that. It's what I'm getting from what you're saying and both of you, this is this phenomenon we call privilege, this phenomenon that really is, it's colonization, and it's this way that humans have structured themselves amongst themselves, of that there's some that get the goods and some that don't, like what's the source of that, you know, the deeper nut that we're trying to crack. And I feel like some of the things you said are just kind of knocking at my unconscious, just like ways of flipping around my usual way of understanding privilege. And I think that's what we need to do in order to unravel this nut somehow of how we got here. You know, what are we doing? You know, what's the separation in our own beings that creates this separation amongst ourselves? Because we know that race actually doesn't even exist, right? It's racism does. Racism does. Racism is very real, but race is a construct, right? I mean, so why did we create all this, and how do we uncreate it? And are we going to be able to do that? So that kind of leads me to the next question, which is actually it kind of skips over the next question in a way, because the next question was, what are ways we see it in our communities, in our lives, and how it affects us? And what are the different kinds of privileges, and what about earned privilege? I mean, there's some kinds of privileges that are, you know, valid, right? Because they're earned. But so that was the next question. But where you've brought us, Bayo, is making me wonder if I should just skip to the third question, which is, you know, we can talk about how we see it in our communities, and I think that this is really important part of the discussion that we're going to invite participants into, is like how do we see it show up in our lives? Because I think that is part of the dismantling and the healing, is to begin to wake up to ways that it plays out for us personally as well as collectively. But that's the awakening. That's the awakening that we're part of. So we can speak to that, but we can also skip to, I think I'm going to leave it to you two to decide, you know, if you want to skip that second question, or what are ways we see it in our communities and our lives, and how does it affect us? Or the third question.
I would like to speak to that.
Okay.
Actually, I had a list of questions that hopefully we will go to later. But to me, so I took an equity class through my kids' school in Berkeley. They offer it for free to parents to combat, like, it was in Berkeley. It was a school that was known to be have a higher percentage of wealthier white students and less African American or otherwise colored. And so this equity class was very eye-opening to me. And one of the openers about that really struck me was a list of questions in which we asked ourselves, you know, do you even know what your privileges are? And one of the questions was, I can go shopping anywhere and not worry that I'm going to be followed or harassed. And I was like, yeah, I don't worry about that. And, you know, and then I realized, oh, other people do, actually. Other people have had historical reasons of why they would think twice about going somewhere that they've never been to, or that people of their race don't go to, because they get harassed, they get followed, they get arrested. There's all sorts of bad reasons, you know, things that happen. And then when especially I've heard this from African Americans, that this is not a comfortable thing. I can turn on the television or open the front page of the paper and see people of my race widely represented. I mean, it's a small issue, but we are all just unconscious to the way we live. Like, I was actually surprised when I was 26 years old. It was the first time I watched a Asian American person on TV, on, like, speaking English, you know, to each other, and it was like a love story, and I was like, ew, like, Asian American people speaking English, that's so weird. Like, I was so weirded out. I mean, I'm just telling you that, you know, I was unconscious to the fact that I had never seen that on TV except for newscasters like Trisha Toyota on TV. And, you know, like, once you realize that, once I realized that, oh, I have a lot of things that I take for granted. And then I ran, you know, kind of started running into circles where I had a voice to point out an injustice that was happening to somebody else. And privileges to be able to keep silent when you see that kind of injustice, because you can look the other way and it's too hard. You know, this stuff is too hard to face. So if you're comfortable, you don't want to challenge other people. You don't want to get into a situation of discomfort. So you keep quiet, and that keeping quiet is privilege, you know. And I'll stop there. But I just want to say that we are often unconscious, and I own that for myself, and which is why I've tried to really be more aware of the injustices that are happening around us, and it's rampant. Check.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm really glad you grabbed onto that second question, because you're right. We shouldn't skip over that. And you know, these issues are real. I grew up in a fairly liberal home. My mother was did a lot of social justice activism, so I was exposed to that pretty early. And so I thought I was really educated. You know, I thought, okay. But I remember, you know, I knew what privilege was. I kind of knew, you know, I kind of had a sense like, oh yeah, I don't want to be a person of color in this society, because you know, I remember doing that scenario in my head, like imagining how my life would be if my skin was brown or black, and how I realized, wow, you know, I wouldn't want that. And that scared me. That really scared me. That woke me up. And I realized back then, that was when I was still growing up, and I went, something's wrong here that I feel that way. It's just not right. But I still didn't get it, to be honest with you, until I actually went to Standing Rock and I saw firsthand my indigenous friends being put in dog cages, for God's sake, after being arrested. It blew my mind to actually see it in front of me in real life being played out. So I was changed from the inside out after that about the differences, because I know I wouldn't, if I was arrested, be put in a dog cage. And I'm sorry, that just makes me want to cry right now, just even thinking about it. And that people are treated that way. So we'll leave it at that. I'll hand it over to you, Bayo, if you want to jump in there.
Yes, I write and speak a lot about the ultimate. Well, I will take back the word ultimate. So the world is constantly dancing left and right to disturb our notions of what is ultimate or not. So I'll take back the word ultimate. But I usually write and speak about the slave ship. In fact, I've just written an essay that is making the rounds at the moment, called I, Coronavirus, Mother Monster Activist. And I write it from the perspective of the slave ship, from the perspective of the virus. So performing some kind of speculative fiction there with that. And when I write about the slave ship, I see it as this, you know, this very, very striking and electrifying embodiment of privilege. You know, it's the architecture is such that those who were on the upper deck were defined as humans, and those who were in the cargo hold were not quite human. And then in the beige section was where sugarcane and all the products in the triangular trade was stored. All the products of the triangular trade were stored in the last section. And I think society mimics that today in ways that are quite unexpected and probably largely unarticulated. I was in Brazil and I was taken through a place called Pequena, Africa, which is the place in Rio de Janeiro where the slaves first ported, landed, and were shipped from the borderlands into their plantations. And I was told very remarkable stories of how mountains were blasted open with dynamite to build a port, to make way for that very booming economic, that trade of bodies across the Atlantic. And then sometime in the 19th century, in the 18th century, the slave ship disappeared. And I remember remarking to the tour guide and the people who invited me to speak in that country that the slave ship didn't quite disappear. It just became something different. It melted into the cobblestones and the shining cities and the gleaming towers and the economy of fiat currency. It became something different. It became something more intelligent. So that in a very shocking sense, we are all still on slave ships. We are all still mimicking, performing, and participating in an economy, a history that privileges the definition of the human as the principal entity on the planet. And every other reality is just this performance to reach the level of the human. And that explains in some sense, not in an encyclopedic sense, but in principle, it explains the work of contemporary activism today, to get people to the upper deck, to open the hatch so more people can breathe on the upper deck. So that's the whole paradigm of representation, exclusion versus inclusion. Let's bring more people to the upper deck. Let's acknowledge more people as humans. And yet, even if I get to the upper deck, my being on the upper deck is still a mark of privilege. It's still an exclusion of other bodies, because the human doesn't work without exclusion. Something is cut out of the picture. Even if I become acknowledged in the justice systems of modernity, I am still participating I'm still on the slave ship, in a sense. I'm still here on the slave ship. So I've been asking the question, what are the ways of disturbing the slave ship? If I try to escape from the slave ship, I'm giving it power. And many did try to escape from the slave ship. My people, especially the Igbo people from Nigeria, were said to have drowned in an effort to leave the slave ship. But that, in a sense, only reinforced the slave ships, not to say that their efforts, told many times in stories by my elders, not to say that that was in vain. But the slave ships still continue to exist. And then my people, teach me about power and privilege and this is what I want to share with everyone. Because I asked the question when I started on my decolonial journey, whatever that means. I started to ask, why is it that if we have gods and goddesses that are real and powerful, why is it that they didn't intervene when these people came and took us away and took us to the so-called New World? Why didn't they do something about that? And I recall, hearing about power not as domination or something some people possess, power as the undoing of worlds, power as the undoing of bodies. I heard the story of Eshu, who is a trickster figure in Africa, in Nigeria, was said to have mounted, and I don't know, Jul, did I tell this story the last time we passed? Can you remember me telling this story? No? You're muted.
Tell it again.
Okay.
Yeah.
I remember hearing the story of Eshu stopping people, stopping an insurgency of gods from actually defeating the colonial lords, by giving wine to one god who was going to help the Africans and chase away the bad slave people, and Eshu actually traveled with the slaves across the Atlantic. It is said in our stories. And the meaning of that story is that sometimes power hides in defeat. That even in places of undoing and composting and the breaking of bones and the breaking of bodies, that other worlds sprout from there, and other possibilities are invoked, conjured when my wounds are open, when the whiplash of a slave master's whip, marks my body and breaks open, a wound that's offers a libation of blood. That in those moments, I am not only undone by the whip, the person who's whipping me is also undone in that moment. So that power or privilege is never a one-way affair. We might put whoever does that in the United States, the regime, I believe, the Trumpian regime, might put kids in cages, and might show that as, the ultimate performance of American exceptional might and power. But in a sense, it is undoing its own self. It is, in performing that kind of power, it is strengthening its resolve to be this separate and monolithic entity in a world that is fluid and changing and transformative. And therefore, it is making itself more susceptible to damage and death and demise. The reason why modernity is so impractical at emotional levels for people, in probably ways that most of us cannot define. The reason why most of us want to scream, but have no places to do so. The reason why we have no places to grieve, apart from a psychologist's office who is timing you and often inviting you to pay him or her for your space of grief. The reason why we don't have most of that is because modernity is a paradigm of stability. It wants to enact privilege as a fixed entity for all time. The world today, in terms of climate change, in terms of COVID-19, is saying, nope, there are other prerogatives, there are other imperatives, there are other places of power that are possible. I'll take it from there, and maybe if we go further in the discussion. But Joe, I wanted to say this, that it's not that race doesn't exist, and that racism does. I think most of the time we unknowingly perform this scientific empirical notion of reality, that if science, this foundational way of knowing, has a judged race not to exist, then therefore it doesn't exist. I believe it's not things that exist or do not exist. It's not a question of whether it exists or not. It's what are its effects? What does it change just by being there? Imagine, for instance, this is a hypothetical, that tomorrow you wake up and you learn that it was all a ruse, that somehow some data got mixed up somewhere, and the COVID-19 virus, the coronavirus, doesn't actually exist. We're sorry. It is just a mix-up somewhere, and it is just a flu. It's not really this thing called the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Nothing of the sort. That doesn't mean it hasn't been real in very, very strong, in very, very striking ways. That doesn't mean the economy hasn't tanked as a result. So things are known by their effects. Even lies exist by definition, according to the effect. Santa Claus exists not because he has empirical reality, but because of the effects he has on other bodies, or it has on other bodies. So yeah, the question of whether race or racism exists, I think in terms of how we talk about it, even how we deny it, in terms of how society is framed, in terms of the things we're doing, it does have material effects and should be analyzed or embraced, of course not accepted, but approached by those measures.
Yeah, thank you for speaking to that, Bayo, and I agree with you. Actually, race exists as we've created these differences amongst us, and including how dominance and oppression gets played out based on our race. But I think what I meant about race itself is essentially there's this I mean, without the effects, just this continuum of skin color that many of us are mixes of. And so I think I'm just speaking to that, but yeah, I totally agree with you that its effects are real and we need not to downplay them in any way. And so that was not my intention, but thank you. Go ahead, Aya.
I have heard through my equity class, and I kind of just am quoting my equity teacher, but you know, she says that race was initially in the United States, at least, it was a construct and a categorization for the census. And we needed to create these categories so that we can categorize how we were going to allocate our funds as a nation. Another kind of funny thing that I just want to point out is I think colonialism and the extraction mindset is at the root of both climate change and some of the social injustices and privileges that exist out there. And you know, right now the environmental movement is really struggling to include Black, Indigenous people of color, to engage with the front lines and to really include that population in the conversation. But the root of the problem is the same. And it's like, I feel like it's this awakening process where we're like realizing, oh, it's all connected, you know, and we're not quite there yet. And that to me is where I see the privilege of the people, you know, whether I'm not just talking about race, you know, we say the word white privilege, but it's also economic privilege and all sorts of other privileges that exist. And, you know, the people that can kind of get by without their islands being underwater, and, you know, the people who caused climate change actually are the developed nations, which are mostly white. And the people bearing the brunt of it are mostly people of color, Black and, you know, brown. And so that is a humongous injustice. And for the people that caused climate change to have that privilege to say, I wonder whether we should do something about those people, you know, that's privilege. And to not be able to not do anything, I don't know. I mean, we as individuals might not have the power to, but there's privilege hidden in there somewhere. I don't know.
Sister, could I
yes,
speak to that?
Yes,
speak
please.
To that, but so I acknowledge that the word the Anthropocene is this planetary ethic that is basically about look, we're all in trouble. You know, we're definitely in trouble right now. So let all humans unite and do something by 2030. Because, you know, we're all the shit is going to hit the fan by then. And so everyone needs to have their hands on deck. There we go again. And I think the Anthropocene, like you rightly are speaking to, you're pointing out, it forgets its legacies of extraction and dispossession and denial and suppression and invisibilization and backgrounding. It pushes that aside and proposes that we all march forward into the future, holding hands together, kumbaya style. Well, there's a problem with that because as some of my brothers and sisters say, a serious approach is not to turn to the future, it's to turn to the past. And I think they even mean not the past as a past of the creation of this linear time framework that marches from past to present to future, but a different conception of time altogether. But let me not jump the horse here.
Yeah, I think we're in agreement.
What I would like to point out there is that we kind of fall into the trap of modern analysis when we say that yes, all these things happen, but they caused it by definition. um, um, white people. And when I speak about whiteness, I don't even mean white identified bodies. I'm not referring to white identified bodies. I'm referring to a paradigm that enlists white identified bodies as its prime representation. But it exceeds white identified bodies. It's a vocation, it's a planetary making vocation. Before we saw white people, we were affected by whiteness. Whiteness is the idea that the world ought to be flat, that the wilds ought to be pushed as far away as possible, and the city should have no limits. Whiteness is the idea that rationality undergirds the universe and everything should be intelligible. And they were entitled to meaning. You know, what's the meaning of the COVID-19 situation? Somebody answer me. And if we have the chance, we will call for the manager of the universe to give us answers right now. You know, we're entitled to answers. It's modernity and whiteness is this paradigm of entitlement and rights and privileges. It's also, and this is more nuanced, noticing. It's also this paradigm of easy causal relationships, easy causalities or easy temporalities. Because the same paradigm we're trying to defeat is the one that gave us this idea of cause and effect, simple causal relation. They caused it is actually the language of the slave ship. When we melt into compost realities and notice feminist, very powerful eco-feminist notions and voices, some of which are even American, that have informed the things that I say and the things that I learn. You know, when we dive into that, then we might notice that it didn't start with a bunch of bad people causing climate change. It goes far beyond them. It's how the world itself, geological shifts, it's how sugarcane instigated the economic trade. Not to say that these are things that are stable, like it's now the fault of sugarcane. Let's banish sugarcane. I'm trying to bring our attention to how we tend to, most of us tend to instrumentalize or perform this reductionistic analysis that assigns causality, agency, and blame to a particular group of people or a particular aspect of reality, not noticing the entanglements, you know, that are already there. Like, what makes us human is the non-human. What other questions are possible when we allow ourselves to move with the stream and see the other things that are at work in the world around us? The reason why I say this is because if we speak truth to power, and I'm echoing Fred Moulton, a Black professor who wrote the book, The Undercommons, on fugitivity. If we speak truth to power, we run the risk of participating in that power and then getting trapped. So he says, one does not speak truth to power. One disturbs, this is my own addition, one disturbs the claims of power to be exclusively powerful. And this is how fugitive slaves and fugitives, across the Atlantic learn to undercut power. They refuse to take in the language, the premise, the analysis, the ethics, the values of colonization that says, you're to blame, you're to blame, you're to blame, you're to blame. They moved aside from that and they created fugitive worlds in the great dismal swamp between North Carolina and Virginia. They created societies, they created favelas, you know, outside of the city. They created slums, they created places. None of these are harmonious or romantic places, but they disturbed the singularity and exclusivity of the single story of privilege. And so this is just what I want to turn to. Nothing we've said here is amiss, and I'm not. That's not my job to point out things that are amiss, but to invite to articulate a deeper invitation. The invitation that says, if there are other places of power, then what kinds of questions and stories can we be telling right now? Or else we get trapped in this tug and pull of privilege.
Wow, Bayo, I so resonate with everything you say. And one question comes up in mind, it's like, being in kind of in communities, the circles of people that really do endeavor to unplug from that colonized mindset, that are trying to just find privilege in what wealth in other definitions than the one that we've been given, and I know that there's a great variety of that, and it's wonderful. But my question is, you have a community of people that are finding other centers of power. They have other definitions as you're talking about. But let's say they have land that the colonized world wants to come and grab the resources of, and they want to stop that, and they have to speak to that power in some way. So that interface is what we seem to be at, the loggerheads in this world. There's the people that really are trying to unplug from this idea of privilege and the idea of the colonized system, but they're still running up against it at these front lines and these interfaces. And how do we deal with that? If you're forced to deal with it, they're taking your child away, for instance, or something like that.
Right. It's not an easy question to respond to. I would just point out, and I wonder where this might take us to, however controversial it sounds. I will point out that the idea that we can summarily, unilaterally unplug is an imagination of privilege. That we can stop being privileged is an imagination of privilege. That we can just turn it off, or go to a workshop and learn the ABCs of unplugging from privilege and pay $500 for that, and that's it. I like the earth-based flat ecology wisdom that say, this is not up to us. This is not entirely up to us. It's what philosophers call the fallacy of the converse, where you might notice that some conditions are necessary, but you equate those necessary conditions or you sublimate those necessary conditions to levels of sufficiency. And what all of that means is just like saying that we can do something about privilege. And most of the time, what we can do in terms of transforming the ways we relate with others, transforming our systems, transforming our world, pointing out that privilege is very problematic. And by privilege, I'm speaking specifically about the particular kind of privilege that is showing up in our conversation today, which is whiteness, modernity, the flattening of the world, the learning of mastery to gain supremacy over the planet, over non-humans and inhumans and yet to be humans. That privilege, it's the idea that we can leave it behind. We can just drop it and save ourselves and be good people is an imagination of privilege itself. It's just like I say that the effort to think outside the box is what boxes think about all day. I'm sure. Like let's leave all of this behind. Let's just drop it behind. I don't think that there's a dropping possible. I don't think we can walk out of stuff, that we find problematic, especially in a universe that is entangled and entangling. Abandonment is not possible. But there's a place for holding space for noticing differently, for doing the modest work of allowing ourselves to fail and celebrating that failure. I continue to refer to this place as fugitivity, or as fugitive incapacitation, or making sanctuary. That is, there's probably a place for us to share the gifts of cacophony. The city is this harmonizing of voices. Everything is nice and pristine. The place where we're invited to dwell right now, especially with the COVID-19 phenomenon, rifting the fabric, tearing the fabric of whiteness apart, the place we're invited to dwell in are the places where things don't quite make sense. Now, that's what fugitives did as a way of upsetting the colonial powers. And I can just refer to this very briefly, that they they encoded their worlds into the traditions of their masters. For instance, the Santeria religion in Brazil did not start by people coming together in a committee and saying, let's start a new religion. No, it was the Yoruba people from, which is now Nigeria, my country, taking the gods, Eshu, Oya, Ogun, Shango, all of them, and encoding them in Jesus, St. Paul, St. Peter, all the saints, all the sainthoods, and then speaking the names of Jesus in public, but knowing amongst themselves that they were actually worshiping and invoking and conjuring the powers of their own gods and goddesses. So this underground act of inserting realities and letting them germinate and grow in the husk of the colonial is the space of the fugitive. And it's not entirely up to us how it pans out. This is the work of generations. Our failure will be what we bequeath to our children and to the children around us. I don't think there is a place where we can decide on a manifesto that will help us walk out of colonization, out of privilege. But there is a small, soft, fertile, fecund place of staying with the trouble. I think this is what Donna Haraway calls it. Just staying with the trouble of our privilege, noticing, speaking about it. And I don't mean that's all we can do, but just doing that might, change our senses of what is possible. Because most of the time in our efforts to change the world, we end up reinforcing the same things we're trying to change.
I love that, staying with the trouble. And it's exactly what we're endeavoring to do here, is just be with the conversation.
I'll add, though, that I do have an agenda. I want us to be talking and recognizing our own privilege, but I also want others to, and myself, to show up when you see injustice and utilize your privilege for good.
Yeah.
Because that's why we have it.
Yeah.
I mean, to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
It may not be why we have it, but it's what we do with it.
That's what we do with it. Exactly. To the extent that we have privilege. My ideal is that somebody else, if I'm being harassed or, somebody else will come in and help me.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Yeah.
sister, I feel like if it were possible across pixels, and if it were not unethical right now in this time of social distancing, I would just give you a hug.
Thank you. Thank you for the hug. I accept.
Because I know in my bones how it feels to. I've been helped many times by good and goodly folk, just saying, excuse me, that is wrong, and being helped. We all want to be noticed and acknowledged, and sometimes, just for that effort, that space that acknowledges that I'm real and I'm not the epiphenomenon of your own existence, that I have body and history and story and yearning and want and desires of my own, can be the most affirming thing ever. So I love that, and we're in this together, sister. There's a space for resistance. There's a space for calling out privilege and saying yes. I mean, wherever you find that you can help, do help. And at the same time, and I don't think this is an either-or situation. I think we need to do the work of building other worlds where colonization isn't possible. I think to do that requires that we compost ourselves, because victimhood, this is ironic, probably controversial, but being victims can be part of the furniture of what makes privilege work. The idea, and this is why Fred Moulton says, one does not speak truth to power, because you will be inadvertently participating in the same powers that you're trying to deny. It's just another way that my people put it, that what one resists one ultimately becomes. You know, the Democrats resisting the Republicans have now summarily become, in many senses, very Republican type politicians. So in a sense, beyond resistance, there's a space, probably a Roomian space, and it's not poetic or fanciful or a flight of imagination to say that there are historical precedents for people upsetting power, not by defeating it, but by denying it its powerfulness, you know, its right to be exclusively powerful. And the way they did that is by going underground, descent, by finding ways to undercut that power. And I think we can be doing that right now. We can be doing that. I mean, people are already doing that right now. And we may not finally get rid of privilege, in white privilege specifically again. But again, our work has never been up to us. It is intergenerational. Even our failure matters.
Mm. Wow, even our failure matters. I love that. Yeah, more and more I've been feeling how much I'm just part of this very long timeline that I don't see either end of. And that just to surrender to this journey without needing to know how it's going, where it's going and how it's going, just knowing that all I can focus on are the choices I make day to day. And to speak, to do these kinds of discussions are one of my choices and our choices. So we are coming kind of to the place of questions and answers and a little bit of discussion. So I'd like to just kind of wrap up this part of the conversation. And I want to invite people to ask questions in the chat. And that'll make it a little more easier to get through them. And then we may go into a place where we can bring your videos back on. But Ayako, did you want to say something?
We had a third question that we did not get to. It's how do we dismantle a system of privilege? What would that look like? Do we need new systems? Can we reform the current one? I'll give a 1-minute answer to that. I really think that Americans are really good at talking this stuff through. We've been trained like Woody Allen style, you know, talking this through with our analysts and our therapists, and we have the language. And, you know, the leadership of the environmental movement is now really coming out with this vulnerability language where we have to get messy, we have to get through this, we have to talk about it and make mistakes. Just like Jul encouraged us at the beginning of this seminar to make mistakes. And I really think that's where we are stepping into, and I look forward to more conversations. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. In fact, maybe we can take that third question into to the audience and ask all of you out there this question, and anything else that you might, if there's a thread in there that you really want to pursue, you can also bring that up. But the third question was, as Aya said, was how do we begin to dismantle a system of privilege? And we've already been kind of talking about this. I know Bayo has already really gives some amazing insights around ways of holding this. But what I want to hear from, we want to hear from all of you, what you think that would look like. Do we need a new system? Can we reform the current one? Should we even be talking about systems? I mean, it's kind of wide open. What this looks like, how we go forward. So just want to invite people to ask questions right now in the chat, and then we'll open it up to discussion in a bit here.
Can everybody turn on their cameras now? I'd love to see.
Yeah, might as well do that. Let's do that. If you want to turn on your cameras.
Yay.
Thank you, Aya.
Yeah.
So just raise your hand if you have something you'd like to ask or bring up. And if it's a comment, just my request is that just make it concise. And go ahead and raise your hand, and I'll just look to see who's out there We only see a few videos.
I can't get Zoom to work, but this is Raven. I'm waving my hand.
Oh, Raven. Hello, Raven. I'm so glad you made it, Raven. Go ahead and what would you like to share?
I would just like to add that even though we have a broken system, everybody matters on helping the people that are stuck and disconnected, and we need to stay on top of that on whatever level that we're able to individually, because it all works together and it adds up and it makes a difference in the long run. As long as everybody who can do anything is doing something, then that will help bring the good changes that we all want to see happen with this. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Raven. Raven has been working on the front lines of a lot of mutual aid work, and
Thank you for doing that.
yeah, she's been doing some amazing stuff. So anybody else would like to make a comment or a question? Tomas.
Hi, thank you. I've struggled with what to do about our economy, our economic system of capitalism, because it seems embedded in that is privilege, is white privilege, and privilege to those who have money and so on. And I think the only thing I can do is, whatever confronts me in the day, in my day, do whatever I can, in the face of privilege and entrenched power, do whatever I can to create more justice and equality. I don't think we're going to get rid of this system, but it can be depressing and, what can I do kind of thing. The only thing I can do is take baby steps, whatever it is that I come up against in my day, to be a voice for justice and equality.
Thank you. Scott?
Thank you. I am a part of a new group that is looking to bring the principles and practices of restorative justice into the community to heal harm outside of the justice system. So we call it Healing Justice. It's a multiracial group under the auspices of the local NAACP. And I would really love to hear some practical suggestions for things to think about as we go forward. We've already determined that we need to hear each other's stories and get to know each other before we go into, doing mode. But I would love to hear any practical suggestions for things that someone like me would benefit from thinking about as we go forward with this initiative, which is very visionary and very cutting edge, in my opinion. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah. Aya.
Yeah, I have some practical suggestions that I got through my equity class again, which is to really try on seeing the world through another lens. Not your own perspective, but somebody that is from a different economic spectrum in society, and maybe even a different skin color. And in the shared doc, I tried to post a bunch of questions, as well as some psychological, like under the psychology heading. There's a Dr. Joy DeGruy, there's a psychologist who's African-American, who talks about the post-traumatic slave syndrome. And she talks about, because of the history of slavery in this country, the African-American people of our country have a pre-existing condition of being afraid, fearing others, and not being able to step out of that. And for me, that was really useful to really kind of let that sink in. And I'm not sure, you know, maybe you're already there, but for me, that worked.
Thank you.
And also the front lines are just, there's so much going on.
Hi, I'm G. I would just like to just complicate something that Ayako just said in response to Scott's question about what do we do. I think, you know, a lot of people who see themselves as being in a privileged skin color class, what have you, are always looking to understand from other people, from other like underprivileged people. So that approach is problematic, because what it does is it shifts the burden of responsibility of educating on the so-called underprivileged people. So
How does it shift it?
Like trying to understand other, like that's important to read as much as possible and talk to people who are simply different from you. And what I mean by that is, you know what, I would not normally talk to this person, and I'm just gonna talk to this person. And go beyond the ordinary kind of surface discussion. But I think that itself is kind of advanced, actually. And I don't think it's, you know, we're talking about vulnerability and like this. I think the first place to start is yourself and the civilization that you come from. That is so important to start with where you are. I mean, I just feel like most of the discussion about privilege and oppression and trauma locates trauma and oppression somewhere else, you know, abroad. Look at those people, or you know, but it's sort of like we're all traumatized. We all have intergenerational trauma. White people have intergenerational. You cannot be a part of this civilization. You cannot have been born into this and raised in this civilization, in this post-colonial world, without on some level having, embodying some kind of toxicity.
Yes.
So I think it's very important to really look at within yourself and recognize that and approach other people in that way. Actually, when I read Joy DeGruy book, I was very moved. It was a very moving book, but I really felt that she located the intergenerational trauma. And I understand why she's doing that, but I was like, you know what? Korean Americans have so much intergenerational trauma, and Asian Americans are like so left out of this, you know, right, Ayako? So, you know, I see you, but this is nothing new.
I hear you. Yeah.
New.
I actually have been saying to my friends, inner resilience is social justice. Social justice is inner resilience, because it's so interconnected with our own resilience. And the work is on ourselves to a large extent. So I agree with you, and thank you, G.
And actually, we are healing our trauma right now. Doing these kinds of dialogues, this is part of the trauma healing. At least I believe that. I don't know. Maybe I'm happy to hear differing opinions about that. But part of, because I work with people with trauma, and I know that one of the healing modalities is social connection and being able to be witnessed and to share. And it's as simple as that. And so we're doing that. And so we're healing, the trauma that we have around this intercultural, intergenerational, historical, interracial traumas that we have. This is the intention here, and I mean, we're figuring it out. I believe we're on this. I don't know if I want to use the word ship now that after hearing Bayo, after hearing you talk about the ship. So we're on something together here. Richard, you raised your hand a little bit ago. Did you have something?
Yeah, I would just like to recommend a pathway that's complementary with Joy DeGruy's work. And this is the work of somebody who to me is pretty amazing, Resmaa Menakem. And he does work that, while it takes into account the cognitive aspects of privilege and what he calls white body supremacy, but goes how it's sunk deep into our somatic experience, deep into our nervous system, and how to deal with that. And so he has on his website some free resources, which are really cool. And also a book, his book, which is very experiential and very informative. It's called My Grandmother's Hands. And it addresses the embodied white body supremacy that's embodied in the African American experience, the white experience, and also in particular police officers' experience deep down in their bodies. And I think it could probably be applied to any kind of embodied white supremacy, and not only for the relationship to the African American lived experience, but other groups as well. But Resmaa Menakem, yeah, really cool stuff.
Can you spell out his name in the chat box? I'm going to Google that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Galen.
So yeah, what a rich conversation. Thank you, everybody. Really grateful to be here. So I had a few thoughts to share, mostly around this idea of just appreciating, interconnecting the different scales, the individual scale and the collective scale and the relationships. I see Scott appreciated, Jul said, trauma happens in relationship and will be healed in relationship. And so I like to think of it as this simultaneously individual and collective project. And it's a process. Healing is a process. And I appreciate how Bayo pointed out in last month's session that part of healing is, I forget how exactly you said it, Bayo, but focusing on embracing our story rather than trying to purge our story of this bad thing that we wish was not part of us. And so, and that happens on an individual process. We have to, when we experience trauma, we have to, it helps us to learn how to appreciate that as part of our story and embrace it as part of our story and learn what value and gifts were in that in order to move forward. Because I've had experience, and I know many people with experience that are stuck in a space of really trying to purge this terrible thing from our history, and it doesn't tend to work. And that's true on an individual level, and it's true on a collective level. And so really recognizing that healing by embracing our story and recognizing that it's part of us. It's not this other thing that came out and then screwed everything up. This is part of the story of source bubbling up into form, all these many forms, and blossoming into life and collapsing, and it's part of the story. This is all, everything is connected. So I'm gonna pass the mic back. I have a lot more thoughts, but I'm taking up a bit of time here, so.
You bring up a question, Galen, that, you know, for me, that I wanted to ask just the group, and maybe if Bayo or Aya has a thought on this, is, or anybody, to heal, do we need to do some what kind of amends, or do we need to do reconciliation? I know there's lots of talk around that, restorative justice. What does that look like? Do we need to do that? I know, Bayo, you talked about we need to go past, you know, not be pushing towards the future. And maybe this time is a time that we're supposed to go into the past. We're digesting ourselves right now in this chrysalis of a time. And part of that digestion, I know for me on a personal level, as I'm going into my own past, are we as a species, do we need to go into the past of the harms created amongst ourselves, the traumas, and find ways to make amends or reconciliations? If so, what does that look like? Yeah.
Well, I remember speaking about forgiveness and reconciliation, and forgiveness as the establishment of boundaries, which is helpful, but reconciliation as the troubling of boundaries. That is, it's not just bringing two sides together. It's asking questions about how those sides emerged in the first place. Maybe I'll address this question about healing from a different angle here. And that is to say, I cannot trust in justice. I cannot trust in equality. And it's not just that, well, Audre Lorde put it this way, not that I totally agree, but it fits for my purposes at this point in time, that the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house. And in a sense, I guess what decolonial activists are noticing is, why do we need to strive for an equal piece of a carcinogenic pie? Or why do I need to struggle for, you know, the first class seat on the Titanic? It's one way of saying the same thing. They speak to each other, that power is defunct. You know, this is a very, I'm not part of the American, well, I am a part of it, and I am just by sitting here with you guys, I am increasingly a part of that conversation about identity and about trauma in the ways that it's conceived in the West. But I want to add this, that, you know, I think this is a very particular moment for social justice movements and struggles and activism as a whole. We have to ask ourselves the question, where is power? Where are we heading? If justice itself is problematic, as is being reviewed by the derelict and the dysfunction of the nation state, and the powers that we all thought at some level was the shiny example that we should move towards. If the top of the pyramid is empty, if the highway does not lead to anywhere interesting, where do we go? That is the question I'm holding at this point in time. If driving forward, if forward movement is no longer possible, then where are the other places where are the other places we can occupy and surround and be in? And so this is the reason why I say I cannot trust even justice. And I'm not the first to say that. Michel Foucault has been writing, or had been writing before his death, about how justice is a part of the problematic system, how justice is itself a furniture of the slave ship. I again, let me add this to the mix. Let me throw this into the compost heap of unintelligibility at the moment. That where the places we imagine we want to be, what we want, what we yearn for, are not left to us. They're also instigations of where we are. That is, our imaginations of what comes next are instigations of where we already are. What if we are performing in thinking about a new system, a new world, a brighter world? What if we're performing the imperatives of this neoliberal capitalist structure that we're occupying right now? I met a person, a brother in Seattle. I just done some speaking, and then he came to me and said, look, I have this great plan for how to create the next system. So this is what we do. We do this, we do this, we do this. And my invitation to us now was my invitation to him, that there, there's a place for sitting still. And this is why I say, in times of urgency, let us slow down. Again, slowing down is not a philosophy of reducing the speed of what we're already doing. It's about coming and bringing ourselves to the crossroads where we meet other realities, where we touch our wounds, where we allow trauma, a space of generosity to become something different. And I speak not as a psychologist, even though my training sometimes gets in the way. But I also know that trauma needs a place of power to be traumatic. Cultural appropriation does not work for Yoruba people. The concept is entirely missing because Yoruba people, especially those who haven't been brought into the modern system or who participate in a very fluid Ifa religious earth-based system, for those people, the notion of cultural appropriation is curious. If you come to those Yoruba people and you steal their things, and you steal their language, and you steal their food, they'll be happy. They'll be clapping and like, yes, take it all. See that white guy over there? He's wearing our clothes. Until you bring them to a place of modern power, where scarcity of, where there's an imbued or imposed scarcity of relationships, scarcity of power and abundance, then everyone scrambles for what's theirs. Don't take mine, you stay to yours. This is the grid, this is the line. It's the same identity project of modernity that is prevalent in the West, that is entirely missing in places like India, where I am now, or places like, so I just want to disrupt the idea that that how we see justice or how we see the next steps is a monolithic thing, that there are other parts of the world that see entirely different from how Americans see this moment. So I want to put that there. And I heard my brother say something about the practical things we should do. What do we do now? And I know what a shaman would say, when he says the practical things. What do we do now? When a shaman tells you to bring a goat or to and sacrifice that goat as a response to climate change, you might spit at him, like I did, and I might still do if I meet some shamans, Yoruba shamans. You might say, what does that do? That has nothing to do with reducing carbon emissions. It has nothing to do with cap and trade. It has nothing to do with the Anthropocene. What has sacrificing a goat got to do with anything at all? And it's this place of the unintelligible, places that don't make sense, that I feel that we're being invited to. Modernity is a paradigm of sense making, where everything is pristine and everything connects in a formulaic algorithm that centralizes the human. What if there are other ways of asking questions about what can we do? What if we can ask, what are the other doings in the world around us that we can listen to, that might purge our senses, of this very tired and exhausted notion that it's entirely up to us and our projects and our systems and our organizations to enact change. Where did we get the idea that the universe is beholden to our notions of what should be or what shouldn't be. Where are the other places of power is my invitation here. There are so many people that are very suspicious of notions of justice and even hope. There are many people that are waking up in the world right now that do not understand what hope means and would laugh at you if you come with a notion of a brighter future, because the future has never worked for them. It has never worked in any way. And they would be quite comfortable with social distancing as it's been enacted now, because the highway has always been a place of social distancing for people in minorities. What I would, and this is probably not a place to do it in a few minutes, there's a lot of unpacking to be done. And there's a lot of practical things that can be done. But there's a place of reaching and building minoritarian assemblages is what I would call it. That is building with the lower deck, going to the people and going to the non-humans, going to the people that have been left outside of privilege to build together with them. And that calls for different ways of relating with each other than you need to educate yourself, which I hear my sister when she says that people need to educate themselves. Yes, but there's also a place for generosity where we notice that we're all in this together. Even with your villainous, disruption of my harmony, I am caught up in you. I am part of you. I am bound in your destiny. The people who defeated my ancestors were also my ancestors. So what do I do with that? What do I do with this body of trauma, of grief and joy, of gratitude and suffering? Where are the spaces where I can compost this, where I can melt, where I can notice other worlds? I'm getting ahead of myself.
Ah, beautiful. I would just offer that we are in that place that you speak of. Where is that place? It seems like all humanity is being invited into that right now, that we're being given that handed that whether we like it or not, as a space to do exactly what you say, Bayo. Almost like I know many people have spoke about the liminal space between the caterpillar and the butterfly as an analogy. And but whether or not that is an appropriate analogy, we seem to be in a gooey place where there is no definition. And I know that the caterpillar, as it turns into a butterfly, becomes goo and is digesting itself after consuming 300 times its weight. Seems kind of similar to what we've been doing. So perhaps that is what you speak to.
Yes. And then the imaginal cells, right, come together and stitch something beyond the agency of the so-called caterpillar. I think we need to be goo-like at the moment.
Yeah, well, I embrace goo right now, and thank you all for being part of this goo that we're in. And we're coming to the close here. We've got a couple minutes to wrap this up. And Aya, I know you were wanting to say something in there. So did you want to?
Well, Bayo said it. I'm really appreciating Bayo's perspective because it's different than mine and it expands my kind of imagination. And that's the kind of like growth that I really think helps us get through this. I'll just say that. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. So,
may I be able to speak and say something here?
Please do. Nathan?
Yes.
Hello.
Hello. Bayo, I just want to say thank you. Everyone, thank you. But to emphasize what Bayo is saying, it's like that African children's riddle. Which came first, the river or the path to the river? And because river is said twice, you get the idea. It's kind of like saying which came first, the plants or the science that extracts their knowledge and their drugs from the plants and synthesize it. So when we get to the idea of the originality, that originality is what gives us the clarity about how we're being guided during the process of the goo. I've heard a lot of people being raised in this country say that they don't know how to think of anything different. Because if we say we have to change the foundation of our paradigm, which is democracy and capitalism, then they think the only thing left is what they've known before, which may be communism or socialism or something. And there's no way that they can allow themselves sometimes to imagine that that very foundation of life that created us in all things can give us insights if we open our hearts and minds to a different way of listening, a different way of feeling. I don't care to call myself Black or African American. There's no cultural history there associated with that. I kind of like the concept of Dene, the people, because we all are. So I think that a lot of what's being said here is that if we go within, guided by the spirit of the truth of life, we will be guided by how to bring truth to each other. Because we will not just walk to somewhere and find out that there is some sort of natural resource and feel like it's okay to extract it to monumental levels and to subject others to it. As the one brother said from South Africa, whose gold is this? Where does the gold go? And it belongs to everybody, and to have a sense of the respect and the place that that gold plays, the oil plays, and all the other resources play, and how much do we really need at any one given moment, guided by that spirit of truth, we will come to truth and reconciliation in a real way. And we won't have to define how we live together as communists or democracy or anything else. We will just be flowing with each other in the truth of life. And that's the way in which we're moving now. Life is moving us in these kinds of ways. And Transition Town, for an example, if everybody just engages in the Transition Town process, you're not doing it because you want to undermine Monsanto or DuPont, or anything. You're doing it because it's the natural way of being in this world as human beings, engaging with doing things for respect for all other beings here and beyond, that is giving us guidance about how to be. And we will naturally, just by default, move Monsanto and any other kind of crazy corporate attitude and actions out of existence, because no one will participate with them. We will go above and beyond. Ashe.
Ashe.
Okay, thank you so much, Nathan. Oh, what a wonderful closing insight to share with all of us. Boy, this conversation, it feels so rich and so deep. I feel like we could keep going for another couple hours. So I want to encourage us to stay connected. There is going to be a dialogue next Sunday that Galen will be hosting that can continue this conversation, Healing Dialogue, and that's the same time next Sunday. That if you want to continue a deeper and go deeper with this dialogue, please join that. We also will be returning next month on it's the fourth Sunday of the month. I forget. Third Sunday of the month, and the next month's theme is on being an ally. Pat McCabe will be coming back, so that's awesome. And we also have the shared doc. Please put your thoughts and links, anything at all that you want to share with us. We'd love to hear it on the Google shared doc, which the link for that is in the chat. I don't know if we could put that link again in the chat. So that's just an ongoing shared doc for all of our building bridges, so that we have just a kind of a place to just track these dialogues and track the links and the things that we've said in there. So any comments you have and questions you have, we welcome you to put them there. And also you can email if you have suggestions for more topics and speakers. And I guess I really don't want to say goodbye. I really don't want to close this. This has just been so incredible. Everybody here, I can feel the richness of all and the beauty here. And Bayo, you're just
Eloquent.
so eloquent, and you evoke so much for me. So I just am deep gratitude to you, deep gratitude, and Aya, deep gratitude to you for the work you've been doing and are doing, and gratitude to everybody here. I know is doing some amazing work on in these realms, and the people behind the scene, Galen and Marissa and the social justice working group here and the interresilient group here. So thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. So
Hopefully we'll be talking more.
we will. This is to me, this is the only thing I personally find the most fulfilling is dialogue. So, and conversation. So we'll make our way.
Yeah, it's deeply appreciated. Thank you, everybody, very much. And Danielle, thank you for all the wonderful notes and comments during the thing. And I had copied those over to the open space doc and want to encourage everybody else to go ahead and gather there and share some thoughts. And we'll stay connected until next week.
Blessings, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.